Right.
And Tosfot overcomes that gap by implementing
Afkeinu.
Right.
Okay? So the basic, what I'm interested in here, right, the basic assumption that Tosfot is working on is that fundamentally there's no distinction between Ishut and Kinyanim. The distinction, which appears to be in the Gemara here, is only because there's a Gzeir. Okay? Let's take a look at the Rambam. Okay? Rambam, we can already predict, based on what we've seen so far, is that the Rambam has no problem in making the distinction Me'ikar Hadin. Okay? That's what I expect to see already, and that's what I will see. Okay? So look, okay. I have to apologize again. I'll just read you the Rambam here. It's in the same Perek. Where did I say it is? It's in Perek. No, it's in Perek, in Hilchot Ishut, Perek Hey.
He doesn't have it.
Halacha Chaf Daled. Okay, I'll just read it to you. Perek Hey, Halacha Chaf Daled. Haomer li'isha, Hareat Mekudeshet li, B'dinar zeh, Al menat shetachzirehu li. Okay? Eina Mekudeshet. Okay? According to Tosfot, Eina Mekudeshet midrabanan. Right? So the Rambam says, Eina Mekudeshet, Bein hichzira, Bein lo hichzira. Whether she gave it back or not. Shim lo hichzirato, Har'el lo mitkayem atnai. And then she stole it. Right? V'im hichzirato, Har'el lo neheneit, V'lo higia li'ada klum. Okay? Me'ikar adin. He doesn't have any derabanan here. Okay? Now, there's something you have to notice here. Okay? So first of all, the Rambam is also consistent. The Rambam thinks that the Kinyan kesef be'ishut is fundamentally different and has different definitions than Kinyan kesef that you find in karka or that you find in metalton. Okay? It's different in two ways. First of all, milveh works in dinei mamonot. It does not work in ishut. Secondly, matana al manat lahachzir works in dinei mamonot, and it does not work in ishut. Okay? The key to the distinction is what the Rambam comes back to the language, and he mentions it a number of times. She'im lo hichzirato, right in this halacha, harei lo nitkayem atnai, v'im hichzirato harei lo neheneit. She didn't derive any pleasure or benefit, depending how you want to translate the word, right? V'lo higia liyada klum. There's two things the Rambam is concerned with. Whether higia liyada mashahu, and whether neheneit. You do not find the issue of hana'ah mentioned in Hilchot Mechira. In Hilchot Mechira, Kone b'milveh works. Right? Why doesn't it work in Ishut? What was the language of the Rambam? The language of the Rambam was, hold on. Why? 1 second. What halach is it? Halacha. 1 second. Chazir lachov. 1 second. Kadesh b'milveh. Right. Halacha Yud Gimel. Perek Halacha Yud Gimel. Hamikat. What? Yes. Hamikadesh b'milveh afilu hayta b'shtar eina mikudeshet. Ketzad. Right? Kigon shayalo atzlat chov dinar v'amar la haret mikudesh li b'dinar zeh she'esh b'yadech eina mikudeshet. Why? Mimnei shamilveh lo hotzanitna ve'ein kan davar kayam. But that's not it. Because if it was just ein kan davar kayam, in mecher also ein kan davar kayam. Milveh lo hotzanitna doesn't change. Okay? Ein kan davar kayam lehenot bo me'ata. There's no hana. Okay? The Rambam requires. Now let's get down to it. So first of all, the Rambam thinks the definition of kesef in Kiddushay kesef is different than the definition of kesef by Dinei Mamonot. That's the first thing. Now, how is it different? Let's drill down a little bit. How is it different? In Kinyan kesef, even a loan is defined as kesef. It's defined as kesef. I gave you the money, even though milva lahotzah nitna, but that chov, that conceptual obligation that you have, is also called money for the purposes of sadot bekesef yiknu. That is kesef. Okay? I once had a very nice experience with an Arab kabbalah who I owed money to. And we put the money aside, because my wife was like that. I don't want to have to spend the money, just put the money aside. So it sat there for like 2-3 months. The guy didn't come to collect. So I called him up and I said, we owe you money. Like I had to run after him that he should come and pick up the 2,000 shekel that I owed him. Right? So he said to me, if you owe, like he didn't feel like he had to come. He knew that it was good. Right? So in a sense, the chov for him, right, was kayam in the world, even if it was only an obligation that I had to pay, right? But it was kayam, right? It answered the definition of kesef. Right? So it is, but in kiddushin you need more than that. It has to be a davar kayam, right? But it has to be a davar kayam lehenot bo me'ata, that there's hana'ah. That in order for there to be kinyan, kesef, and kiddushin, the way it's generally defined is nitinat kesef sheyesh bo hana'ah. Nitinat kesef alone is good for dinei mamonot. Nitinat kesef alone is not good by ishut. Okay, that's a fact. Okay, according to the Rambam, he mentions hana'ah time and time again. Okay, yeah.
Is the difference here? So the difference in the case of using a loan or obligations, he's saying the definition of kesef is different to kinyanim, or is it all riding? Is the difference all riding on the second clause of hana'ah?
Kinyan kesef. No, if you talk about the definition of kesef, this is already semantics, right? Kinyan kesef in ishut is different than kinyan kesef in dinei mamonot. Kinyan kesef in ishut requires hana'ah also.
Right. Okay. If you emphasize the two things, that something came to her hand, and
right, there has to be some exchange of value, right, from which she derives pleasure, right, okay, or benefit, okay, and it has to be now, right? Davar kayam lehenok bo me'ata, and it's not in the case of halva'ah shekvar hotzia oto dinar ve'avra hana'ato. That's a big musavart about spending money in general, okay? After you spend it, it's just a memory, okay? You take a look at halacha Yudalet, the next halacha. Did I give you that? Next halacha in the Rambam? Hayalo etzlam milve ala mashkon. So what's a mashkon? I lend somebody money and they give me an object for security. So I'm holding on to something which is theirs. Okay? V'kitsha ba'ota milve. So he was Makadisher with the halva'ah. But now, since she doesn't owe money anymore, so what's he doing with the mashkon? So he gives her the mashkon back, right? V'chzir la et mashkon. Now Makadesh b'milva eina mikudeshet, right? But in Makadesh b'milva v'chzir la et mashkon harei zo mikudeshet. Shaharei hi neheneit b'mashkon me'ata. Okay? Okay. So the Rambam requires, in addition to matan kesef, he requires hana'ah. Okay? So if we try to think about this, if we go back to what we saw last week and 2 weeks ago, when we talked about how ishut, kinyan ishut, may be different than kinyanim of dinei mamonot. We saw that the din of kavanah may be different, and the din of not kavanah of dat may be different. And we said it could be different in two directions. Either you have a havmin that you need less dat, or you need more dat. But either way, right? What was the language of the? Who was it? Was the Avnei Miluim? That there's nothing, that he's not really buying her, right? That was his language. Right? So therefore, the level of there's something else that's happening. if you talk about creating the Isur Eshet Ish, so for that you could say, well, I can't use Dinei Mamonot as a proof. So just because you need dot in Dinei Mamonot, I don't know that you need dot here. Or you could say you even need more dot. But whatever it is, Dinei Mamonot stops being a guide. Right? So you may need more dot because you're creating an Isur Eshet Ish. So you're doing something else. Right? So that we can now apply to the halacha of kesef. In general, if kesef was just a kinyan, so then you can learn from Dinei Mamonot. Dinei Mamonot, you're not creating an Isser. When you change ownership, you're creating an Isser Gezel. That's true. But it's not the same. Right? You're not creating an Isser Hana, so to speak, like Hekdesh. Right? So in Dinei Mamonot, there's just transfer of ownership. Right? Here, there's a creation of an Isser. So for that, you need a more intense action. And it has to be that in addition to receiving something, which halva'ah is considered receiving something, she also has to get hana'ah. The woman needs to get hana'ah in order to affect the kinyan. Okay? Quote unquote the kinyan. Okay? I'm thinking something else also that, what? What?
You don't see a comparison between the Isser of Eshet and the Isser of Gezel?
There may be a comparison. The Gemara in Sanhedrin says that by Bnei Noach, the reason Huzharu Bnei Noach on Eshet Ish, because Huzharu Bnei Noach on Gezel. Right? But Gezel is not a capital crime for Jews. It is a capital crime, as all Shemot Bnei Noach are. Right? But it's not a capital crime for Jews. So that it's not, technically speaking, an Isser Gezel. It may have certain, if you want to go down that road, right, in different civilizations, it may be that you look at it that way, right? But you don't have to look at it that way. I understand. But here we're talking about an Isser Skila, right? So it's not, and actually he can't, the No'ef cannot return the woman to him, but she actually is Neseret Alav. It's more like Hekdesh, okay? I'm thinking something else, and that, let's talk about Kiddushay Bia for a second. We're not going to do a separate shir on Kiddushay Bia, but I just want to, how would Kiddushay Bia be different than, say, Kiddushay Shtar, or a normal way of understanding Kiddushay Kesef without getting into the Rambam? In general, in Dinei Kinyanim, in general, this help, right? We talk about Kinyan Chazaka, right? The Yerushalmi makes the unfortunate comparison, right, between Bia and Chazaka. But what are they saying? Chazaka in Karka is basically, how do you become the owner of something? Let's talk about ownership. So there are really two ways. One, you could call it de jure, and the other you could call it de facto. Or you could talk about it in terms of a formal legal action which affects a change of ownership, which is conceptual. Or, how do you initiate a new state of affairs? Now I'm the owner of this land. By behaving like the owner of the land. Right? So, one way, if I do kesef or shtar, there's formal action. And because of this formal action, there's a transfer of ownership. Okay? Another way is na'al gadar paratz, that now you go into the field, and you plow the field, with in mind that through this action you acquire ownership of the field. So by acting as the owner of the field, you become the owner of the field. Okay? In Kiddushin, there are also different ways of creating it. You could look at kesef and shtar as formal actions, which is sort of from the top down. It's declarative or an action of a nitinat kesef. That's one way. And the other way is, how do you become married? In a sense, the way it was before Matan Torah. Bia. Right? Bia is, how do you become married? By acting as if you're married. Right? That's what a common law marriage is in general, right? They're acting as if they're married, and we recognize that. So how do you initiate that situation? You initiate it by acting as if you're married. Okay? So Kiddushay Bia would be different than the other acts of Kiddushin in the sense that it goes to the core of creating the Kinyan. as opposed to something external, which we almost artificially say, you do this. We could have said, stand on your head. We could have told the husband, stand on your head, and now you're married. Right? We could create almost any formal action. But the Torah chose these formal actions. Right? It doesn't matter what they are. But Bia is not like that. Bia is from the inside. You create the relationship. Right? So now I'm thinking, maybe, how do you do a formal action where it talks to the inside of the person as opposed to the outside of the person? So you write a shtar, you write the name of the person, and as a Shema Isha, and say you need it to be required to be written Lishma. Okay. And then he gives her the shtar, and she's Mekudeshet. Or he gives her Shabbat Prut, and she's Mekudeshet. So what is Mekudeshet? So you can talk about an Isser Eshet Ish. So now there's an Isser Eshet Ish, there's an Isser Bia, there's an activity. Let's talk about it with that belief sentimentum, as they say. Right? There's an activity which now is prohibited, which previously was permitted. Right? There was no Isser Eshet Ish. So you create an Isser Eshet Ish. That something has to do with regulating the woman's behavior. Okay? So maybe Kiddushay Kesef is not that. So if you say the Kiddushay Kesef requires Hana'ah, right? So maybe you have to somehow, I hate to get mushy about it, but you have to get to the neshama of the person. Because it's not enough to give them something where in return they allow you to Mekadesh them, the woman allows the man to Mekadesh her, or she's makne herself, it depends on the different formulations. But because she received Hana'ah, and Hana'ah is something that goes beyond the physical reality, so in return, even if it's Bahana'at Mechila, it's like, right? There's a sigh of relief which comes from the soul, right? So the Kinyan relates to what's actually being nikneh. So we're not talking about a Kinyan of the guf, like an Eved. An Eved, there's a Kinyan of the guf. Eved Ivri or Eved Knani for sure. There's a Kinyan, Eved Knani, Eved Nachaltem Otam Levnechem, that it's over Birusha. It's a financial ownership, right? But here you have to create some sort of relationship, which we call a Kinyan, but you have to relate. You have to be kona something else, right? What are you kona? So you want to be kona the person, not the person's body, but the person. So you get to the person through Hana'ah.
I don't know what that means. What does it mean to corner the person but not the person's body?
I'll just quote C.S. Lewis, right? What was his quote? You don't have a soul, you are a soul. You have a body. Okay? So C.S. Lewis that quote is attributed to him. In other words, there's something else. Right? You're not kona the guf. When a man is quote-unquote kona a woman, I say quote-unquote, he's not kona the guf. He doesn't own her body in any which way. Right? But there's some sort of relation that he has with her as a human being, not the body. Right? Talked about in terms of her soul. Right? So how do you initiate that? So you initiate that through netinat hana'ah as opposed to netinah of a chayfetz. Okay? Right? So that's perhaps, you have to go to what you're being kona. Okay? Yeah.
What's being described, though, what you're describing here is it's all one-sided. I think that's
we know that.
I mean, it's what disturbs, obviously.
Yeah.
Us here.
We know that.
But I thought you were getting to the fact, like with Kiddushay Bia, that it's a mutual act. I mean, that's the nice thing about it. So,
Not in the Kinyan aspect. Not in the Kinyan aspect. He's Mekadesh. Ki yikach v'lo ki tikach.
And if the woman also did Rose send you her question? Okay.
Yeah, you can ask him.
She was. I want her to phrase it properly because, but it had to do with having somehow part of the ceremony of kiddushin, having the woman also say, not necessarily to. If you have a Har'el at Mekudeshet, so the woman to say something equivalent, like to have more mutuality.
So we talked about that last time. Were you here at the end when we talked about that? We talked about Amarhu, Amrahi,
yes.
And we talked about different ways that you could do that.
But you didn't, last week you didn't talk about something that created a mutuality. That was where she got to give a ring and it had some halachic
Right.
But what
Yeah.
you said was,
Yeah,
now
right.
you accept upon yourself the obligation. That's
Right.
not what we're looking for.
No, I understand.
I mean, the fact that this is an
I appreciate that.
option-
I'm not trying to. But if you want to create in the ceremony, you want to create a mutuality in terms of that he does something and she does something, and you care about it being halachically significant. You could say, I just want it to be aesthetic. That's a legitimate thing. Doesn't have to be halachically significant, right? But if you want it to be halachically significant, so I think Rabbi Linzer's suggestion is a good suggestion. If you don't care about that, so you can stop saying at some point afterwards, after the ksuba, as long as she doesn't say any language of kiddushin, so it shouldn't be misleading, right? So then she could say, as a token of my love, I'm giving you this ring, right? And that's very nice. And everybody can be moved to tears and it'll be really nice, right? But that wouldn't be halachically significant. But if you want to make it halach, I don't mean to be misal, right? But if you want to make it halachically significant, so that was, to do the kinyan sudar on the shiabudim. Okay, so he's mishtabi to her in what he's mishtabi to, and she's niknate to him in whatever she's niknate, right? And that's a certain type of mutuality. They don't do the same thing, but they're both doing something.
Is that the kind of mutuality? Are you, when you finish it, did you finish your class?
No,
Right.
we're still going. Okay, we'll have time for questions. Okay.
So you like this kind of ad that I still don't fully understand what you're talking about.
I'll be happy to try to talk to you about it later. Okay.
The only thing that I think because I think it's important to me to mention the things that are disturbing. What's so disturbing about these Kedushin involving loans is if we talk about the concept of real consent.
That's a very good point.
He's like, and it's such a, his hands is, his yad ba'aliyah, like,
Yeah.
I'll annul the loan for you if you marry me. Oh, and if you don't, you're going to have to pay it right now, or I'll give you an extension. I mean, the consent she has is so
Right.
low.
So here there's certainly room. The assumption here is this consent, right? You're saying that under certain circumstances there should be gzerot, that you're not allowed to do this. There's certainly room for Beit Din to come in. They don't. In these circumstances, they don't. But there's certainly room to say that if you think that there's no consent, that you're going to stop it. There's no stira to that. That's a good point. Right? There's no stira to that. We're just talking about the basic law that assuming there is consent, and this is how they do it, then it's okay. You're going to say that this is a dangerous situation. Yeah, okay. I acknowledge that. And if maybe somebody, protest now or forever hold your peace, and somebody says, you know what, he forgave a big loan and that's why she's agreeing, and it's okay, stop the ceremony and let's figure this out, right? That's possible. Okay, there's not a steer to that. Okay. Let's take a look at, it takes a little further here. The Rambam, let's talk about, it says the arvach lazimna. Okay, now let's talk about arvach lazimna. What is that? What is bahanat milveh? She is mekudeshet. The arvach lazimna. So Rashi says, and Vav bet, yeah. Lo tzrich the arvach lazman halva'ato. Yeah, I'm on Vav bet. Va'amar la hitkatshi bahana'ah zo.
We don't have that, Rashi,
Right. I'll just give you the Gemara. If I give you a Gemara, I assume that you're going to see the Rashi at least. Okay? So, the Arvach Lazman, Halva'ato, V'amar la hitkadshi bahana'ah zo, sha'at hayit notenet pruta la'adam, she'yifaiseni al kach. Oli. Okay? That you would pay me, right, to extend the time. So he's not being mekadesh with the loan itself. He's being mekadesh with the hana'ah that she gets, that she's not going to have to pay the loan back when she thought she would have to pay it back. Say the loan is due in 2 weeks. So he said, you know what? You don't have to pay me back in 2 weeks. You can pay me back in a month. Right? Is that worth money? That's worth money. She would have paid someone a certain amount of money to convince me, to negotiate with me, to collect later. So that's shaveh kesef. And that's what arvach la hazman is, according to Rashi. Okay? Let's take a look at the Rambam. Okay? The Rambam on Harchavat Hazman is here. Right. Yes. Okay. Halachat Tedvav. So the truth is, what I'm really interested in is the Rambam. The reason I put the Rashi on the daf is the Rambam says that there are those that are mefarish things in Harvachat Hazman that make no sense. He's referring to Rashi's sheet. In any case, Hamikadesh b'hanat milva harezo mikudeshet. Ketzad kigon shilva ota ata. Now he's lending her the money. Pay attention. Matayim zuz. ואמר לה, הרי את מקודשת לי בהנאת זמן שארוויח לך במלווה זו, שתהיה בידך כך וכך יום. ואיני תובעה ממך עד זמן פלוני. הרי זו מקודשת. He gives her the money now, and says, normally they say, stam halva'a is 30 yom. Okay? So they say, but you, I'm giving more time. You get 45 days instead of 30 days. And with that more time that I'm giving you, that is worth at least a Shabbat Pruta, that you can hold on to the money for a longer time. That's what Ribis is. Right? Ribis is what you pay to hold on to money. Right? That's why the Gemara is concerned about Ribis here. So, she's Mekudeshet. Right? He can't be Mekadesher with the money itself. That's the milveh. That's not, there's no hana from that, because the money is gone. But she does get hana, right, by the fact that he's giving her the money now. This is a requirement. It's against Rashi. Rashi, she owes him money, and in the middle, he says, you know what, you owe me money, you have to pay me back in 2 weeks. I'm mekadesh you with the fact that now you only have to pay me back in a month. And that, she's mekudeshet. Okay? The Rambam does not accept that. The Rambam says, B'sha'at matan ma'ot, when he gives her the money, shehilva ota ata, now, matayim zuz, v'amar la hareat mekudeshet li, b'hana'at zman she'aviach la b'milveh zo, shetiyeh b'yadech kach v'kach yom, ve'eni tov'a mimech ad zman ploni, harei zo mekudeshet. Shaharei, this is the Rambam again, yesh la hana'a me'ata. She gets hana now. Lishtamesh b'milveh zo ad sof zman shekava. Okay? V'asur lasot, okay? Mipnei shehi kiribit. Okay? Now, u'pirshu rabotai b'hanat milveh dvarim she'ein ra'ui l'shom'an. Other people in the Farsis Gemara, in a way, I don't even want to mention it. Okay? Presumably it's Rashi also. Okay? Now listen to the Raiva. The Raiva is very important. Pirshu rabotai b'hanat milveh dvarim she'ein ra'ui l'shom'an. Amar Avraham, harishonim pirshu kigon shigia zman hamilveh li para. Listen carefully. It's not, there are three possibilities here. There's, when was the harvachat hazman that he wants to be mekadesh with? It could be it was stated in the beginning, that's the Rambam. It could be it was stated in the middle, that's Rashi. What's the third possibility? Stated at the end. What does it mean? Now is the day to pay back the loan. Okay? Kagon shigia zman hamilva li para uma'otav biyada mizumanim lifroa. Listen to that. Okay? She already took the money out of the bank to pay it back. She has the cash in her hand. Right? V'hi hayta notenet miyad biratzon dinar l'mi shemarich lahazman chodesh echad. V'herich la b'schar ha'kiddushin mikudeshet. V'zeu da'arvach la'zimna. V'kol shekein ma shekatav hu. What's the kol shekein? In the case of the Rambam, he's actually giving her money. And he says, you can derive benefit from this money that I'm giving you now for 45 days instead of the regular 30 days. Okay? So he's actually giving her money. So the Ravid says that's pashut. Even when he's not giving her money, If it's higia zman hapiraon and he's extending, that also, even though he didn't give it to her now, the fact that it's time to pay back and she doesn't have to pay back, that is also hana'ah. Okay? It's as if he's giving it to her now. Hold on, I'm being very careful. Okay? Don't jump on me yet. Okay? It's as if he's giving it to her now. Okay? In the middle, it's no good. In the middle, he's not giving her anything now. Right? She has to pay him back in 2 weeks. And he says, you know what, that loan that you owe me in 2 weeks, right now everything is quiet, right? She doesn't have to give him any money. She has 2 weeks to worry about it, right? So, but I'll let you wait. I'll give you another 2 weeks. And with that, I want to be because you now. What did she get now? Nothing. Okay? But if at the time that he gave it to her, at least he transferred the money. If at the time of the payback, so it's also, it seems, that it's like the transfer of money, even though there isn't, because she didn't pay him back yet. Okay? Now let's just take a look. Hold on. Look at the Rambam, as particularly I'm actually interested in the Ravid in the Hilchot Malveh V'Loveh, in Perek Vav Halacha Gimel. Okay? It's here. Haro Rabotai. Okay? Now what happens if we're talking about Kinyanim? Haru Rabotai, the Rambam says, Shaham Malveh et Chavero. We lend someone money. Ulachar zman tava chovo. Va'amar lo, it comes time to collect the loan. So I come and say, okay, time to pay me back. Va'amar lo haloveh, the borrower says, Dor b'chatzeri, ad shechzir lecha chovcha. I don't have the money now, I can't pay back now. You can I have an empty apartment. You can live in my apartment until I pay you back. That's like ribbis, right? Because you get free rent in the meantime, and then you get paid back. You get paid back the keren, and you got free rent for until the guy paid back, right? Hareza avak ribit. That's ribit midrabanan. The reason it's not ribit min Torah is because it wasn't stipulated at the outset. In order to be ribit min Torah, it has to be stipulated at the time of the loan. Okay? Lefisha lo katzat b'shat halva'ah, shenemar lo titein lo b'neshech. It doesn't say not to pay b'neshech. It's lo titein lo b'neshech. So it has to be b'shat halva'ah. Look at the Ravid. Haru rabotai malvet chavero, right? Etc. Amar Avraham. Chaye roshi lo yafeh horu. She'im higia zman hapiraon. This is the way the Rambam describes it. It's the guy's coming to collect. So higia zman hapiraon, right? Va'arvach la zimnei mishum hahu dira, and he extended the time of the loan in return for being allowed to live in the person's apartment without paying rent, right? Kishat matan ma'ot damya. That's a new loan. And that's ribit min Torah. It's kishat matan ma'ot. The kiddushin yochichu. Right? Okay.
But it's dependent on his shita and kiddushin. He's not like, he's saying like what I said in kiddushin will prove, but it's only going to prove because that's what he holds for both of them.
Yes, okay.
So it's
right, okay, fine. Circular, but that's okay. He's like in his own little world there, right? And he's cholik on the Rambam. Okay?
Right.
So he holds that higia sha'at hapiraon, right? Even if the loan is not yet paid back, that is from now on, it's a new loan. This loan has expired, but instead of exchanging money, I pay you back, and you give the money back again, we extend the loan. It's getting an extension on the loan. The extension on the loan is a new loan. Right? You renegotiate, the terms have been renegotiated, and it's a new loan. It's like doing a new mortgage, right? It's a new loan. And that, in Hilchot Malveh V'Loveh, makes it ribit min Torah. Because now you have a new loan, and it's saying, okay, as long as I don't pay you back, you're going to get ribit in the form of living in my chatzer chinam. Okay? So, what the Ravid holds, okay, is that sha'at hapiraon is ke matan ma'ot. Okay? And that is a chiddush. He agrees with the Rambam in principle that you need matan ma'ot, and he disagrees with Rashi. Okay? That just theoretically extending it is sufficient. You need to give something tangible now. Okay? The Rambam says that giving something tangible now is you actually take the money and you give it. Right? So there's your nitina, and the hana'ah begins with the nitina. Because how long do I have this money for that I'm getting? 45 days, and it starts now. So there's nitinat kesef sheyesh bo hana'ah, and that's why arvach lazimna works. Okay? The Ravid says that that's true at the end also. Because when the time is up, even though there's no physical exchange of money, it's as if there's an exchange of money. Okay? And that is enough to constitute ribit d'oraita. There's a new halva'ah with a stipulation at the time of the loan that you're going to get back more than you give. And that's ribit. Okay? Okay. I could stop here, but there's something that you have to notice. And that is that in ribit, he doesn't have anything about that she's holding on to the money. It's just hikiya sha'at hapira'on. But in Hilchot Ishut, it's more than just hikiya sha'at hapira'on. Right? Kigon shigiya zman hamilveh lipara. I'm reading from Hilchot Ishut. Uma'otav biyada mizumanim lifroa. Right? The money is in her hands. Right? So it could be there's a distinction. If I want to know, is the loan up and is this considered a new loan? For something to be considered a new loan, you don't need a ma'aseh nitina. Who says? It doesn't say v'natan. Right? Well, it does say kesef lo titain. Right? But you're talking about when does the loan begin? So if the loan is up on this date, and now we agree to extend it, so it's not really an extension of an old loan. We say it's a new loan. And we're stipulating the extension upon the receiving interest, so that's ribit ktsutsa. You don't need a physical exchange of money in order to have a loan. Did anybody ever go to the bank and get the 500,000 shekel in a briefcase? Right? It just goes from the bank to your kablan, and you pay for the next who knows how many years. Right? You never see the money. There's no need for a physical exchange of money. Right? It's all on paper. Right? So higiya zman hapira'on, and now you say, and then you can pay back in another month, and for that I'm taking money. That's ribit ktsutsa, because now it's a new loan. Okay? But that doesn't work in Kiddushin, even according to the Ravid. Right? According to the Ravid, in Malva V'Lov, we're not talking about Kinyanim either. So forget about Kinyanim. But according to the Ravid, in Kiddushin at least, he requires not only that higiya zman hapira'on, but he requires the ma'ot biyada muchana lefor'am. Okay? So there we can say something much more. That since there is a loan which is due, this has to do with how kinyanim work in general. What makes a kinyan? All right, let's stop. Okay, I'm going to give you kol haTorah kula dinei mamon or something like that in like 1 sentence. What makes a transfer of ownership? What creates that? Okay, so we talk about this maaseh, that maaseh, kesef. If you do kesef, shemeshicha, chazaka, whatever you talk about, right? If you do an action, so the answer is, according to this, it's not the action that actually changes the ownership. What changes the ownership is dot. So what do you need the action for? You need the action to formalize. You could different ways of saying this. Either you could say to formalize the dot or to concretize the dot. Because if I just think something theoretically, most of the time, even if I meditate on it, I don't think about it intensely enough to make the change. But if I know if I'm doing something, that consolidates my intention. Okay? But it's all about creating intention. Okay? Then, under certain circumstances, if let's say, if the overwhelming circumstances of this situation is that the money is going from point A to point B, then that could happen even if there's no physical transfer of the money. The fact that there is a loan that she owes to someone else, and higia zman hapiraon, and hama'ot mezumanot biyada liforo, it's like right here, right? That, I think of like Star Trek, right? It overcomes the quantum leap as if there was a physical exchange. There's enough da'at there. So at that point, he's actually koneh the money. And then, when he's mekadesh her, so then he's giving her the money back. As opposed to simple milva l'hotzah nitna, that's before she takes the money out of the bank. There's just a chov. There's no money. He can't be mekadesh her with that. But once she takes the money out of the bank and she's ready to pay, so that chov begins. There's a process that when she takes the money, when the person takes the money as a loan, when the moment they take the money, so the money stops being the embodiment of the obligation, and the obligation becomes this theoretical legal thing in the air, even though I still have the money in my pocket. Okay, so it stopped being the other person's money. When I come to pay back, so there is no other person's money until I take the money out of the bank, and these are the bills that I'm going to pay back with. And I go and I have the money mizumanot biyadi to pay back. Now there's a reconcretization of the theoretical obligation is now embodied once again in this money. Right? So it becomes the other person's money. And that's why it's a nitina. There's a new nitina here. Because mizumanot biyada leforo, and it's higia shat hapira'on. So the Ravid requires that in order to have the maaseh kiddushin. He may also require that in kinyanim in general. But to define a halva'ah, you don't need that. Right? It is a new halva'ah. Right? But in kinyan, maybe only in kinyan ishut, you need the mizumanot biyada leforo. Okay? Okay.
There's no issue of hana'ah here.
So according to the Ravid does not play on hana'ah. It's tempting, right?
Yeah.
It's tempting. The Rambam might say that there isn't hana'ah because the loan is not completed until it's actually paid back. I mean, that's a rational thing to say. Mizumanot biyada leforam, but it's still nivla hotzah nitna. The money is still not his until he actually does a kinyan on it. And then she's executed her obligation, and the money becomes his when he takes it. That's like the simple thing. If I would have asked you this, without reading you a Rambam and a Raivin, I would say, like, at what point is the loan terminated, right? When you pay back, right? Orach din silver, right? When you pay back the loan, right? Presumably, yeah. So that's what my lawyer says, right? When you pay back. When you pay back the loan.
At this stage, according to what the Ravid said, at this stage there is some kind of like relief or pleasure being had because
right. But I don't think that the Ravid thinks that. You could say that maybe the Rambam would agree. I don't know. The Ravid doesn't think the Rambam agrees, right? But the Rambam requires two things. He requires physical giving of something, accompanied with hana'ah. So this might be a lot of hana'ah, right? But still, he didn't give her anything because the money is still hers until she actually gives it to him. If she gives it to him and he gives it back, so then we started. It's a new story. Okay. All right. We'll stop here on this. Let's just summarize what we have here. If you just look at the Mishnah, kesef, shtar, bia, they're all kinyanim. The simple statement of the Mishnah cannot escape that, right? But the Mishnah in the second parak talks about kiddushin as kiddushin and not as a kinyan. So so the Gemara is concerned about squaring that. Is it a kinyan or is it kiddushin? Okay? So from the simple, straightforward reading of the Gemara, is the only kinyan, is the only activity which can be accurately described as a kinyan is kesef. That's what the Gemara says. Okay? Because of kesef, the Mishnah used the language of Kinyan and applied it, I'm adding, inaccurately to shtar and bia. Okay? Tosfot does not accept that explanation. Tosfot is bothered by it, as maybe there's a Havamina like that. Right? But Tosfot does not accept that. So at the end of the day, it means either kesef and shtar are kinyanim, even though bia isn't. Right? And maybe what we mean by that now, coming to what we said just now, is that kesef and shtar are these de jure activities. They have nothing to do, in essence, with what Kiddushin is. They're just a formal requirement with the way the Rambam says, after Matan Torah, the Torah required a kinyan. So you have to do something. It almost doesn't matter what it is. That's true about kesef and shtar. That's not true about bia. Bia is a different, even if it's a kinyan, it's a different type of kinyan. It's a kinyan of how do you initiate the relationship? By initiating the relationship. How do you get wet? You jump into the pool and you get wet, right? So there's the way you initiate the relationship is by initiating the relationship. So bia would be different than kesef and shtar. Okay? So along the lines, just pick up the thread that kesef may be different than shtar and bia, is what we find in Rabbi Tafshel Rashi and in the Rambam, that kesef, in fact, is midrabanan or midivrei sofrim, by virtue of the fact that the Gemara says that they're willing to do afkin rabbanan kiddushim minei in kesef, but more hesitant about bia. Okay? So from that, Rabbi Tafshel Rashi said, and presumably the Rambam got the same idea, that kesef is midrabanan. Maybe not exactly Rabbanan, midivrei sofrim. Why? What difference that should make? Not sure. Okay. When you look at trying to define what kesef is, so again, kesef may be different. In that kesef in Kiddushin does not operate the same way kesef operates in Kinyanim. Okay? That depends on the machloket that we saw across the board between the Rambam and the Balei Tosafot and the Ravid as well. Right? In this, the Ravid sounds like he's in the camp of the Balei Tosafot, where they consistently align kinyanei ishut with kinyanei mamon when it comes to kesef. Whatever definitions you have of what constitutes kesef in kinyanei mamon, those same things in principle apply to dinei ishut. If there's a difference, for example, in the matana manat lachzir, that difference is only midrabanan. Midoraita, there's no distinction. Okay? As opposed to the Rambam clearly draws a distinction between kesef ishut and kesef of dinei mamonot. Kesef ishut requires nitina sheyesh bo hana'ah. You see that in Mekadesh b'milveh. You see that in Aruch Lazimna. You see that in Mekadesh Yidei the Mashkon. You see that in Matana Manat Lahachzir. All these things are nitina sheyesh bem hana'ah when they work, right? Or Matana Manat Lahachzir doesn't work because it's nitina she'ein bo hana'ah. Okay? Whereas, again, according to Tosafot, Tosafot aligns them. Okay? And finally, something very interesting in the Ravid, in terms of it's more interesting in terms of defining what's nitina for a kinyan as opposed to nitina for what's considered executing a loan. Okay, or executing your requirement to pay back a loan. Okay, whereas there's a temptation where we see the Ravid talks about muzumenet biyadal lefor'ai giazman apiraon. We'd be tempted to say that maybe it's hana. That's the first when I first saw it, I said, but the Ravid doesn't say that any place. So it's much more reasonable, just want to think what the Ravid thinks. The Ravid thinks that in Kiddushin, in order, he would require a real nitinat kesef. But he's willing to say that if ma'ot biyada lefor'am b'sha'at pira'on achov, that is close enough to nitinat kesef to constitute nitinat kesef. Whereas the Rambam could disagree with that. The Rambam would say you need nitinat kesef mamash, which is why he talks about Aruch Lazimna at the beginning, at the time of the loan, and he's marviach, and he extends the time at the time of the loan. So he's giving her hana'ah of time extension, which begins now, and he's giving us something physical now. Okay? See. What I want to talk about next week, I want to get into whether chuppah and nisuin are kinyan. That is very important in terms of understanding two things. One, common law marriages, which we'll discuss. There's a tshuva which I'll send you of the Sridei Eish. It's very important about that. And the second thing that's very important is the whole issue of t'nai b'nisuin, the ability to make a t'nai in kiddushin, and that t'nai should not be mevutal b'shat nisuin. Okay, so we'll talk about that. I don't think we'll be able to talk about all that next week, but we'll begin. So we have to talk about chuppah and nisuin and common law marriages and t'nai. Okay. All right.